Good?
Okay, just started.
Okay, good morning. So we know that Kola Esek B'Teira Se'ela Kilu Hikriv. That because it's Taka Baraisa Bara Alma, Hashem looked into the Torah and created the world. And the end of that Zohar, that famous Zohar, says Kach Barnash or Kach. Same thing. We also Taka Baraisa V'Kayim Alma. Most people are not familiar with the second half. And that's why we look in Torah and we preserve the world. So this is a basis of so many things of when you want to impact the world around you. So there are things we do in action and we actually get involved. But we know that since everything comes from Torah, that when you learn the sugya of what is happening in the world in Torah, that also has an impact at the root level. If you want to put it like in the inner wiring of existence, because everything that happens below is driven by what's Lamaila above, especially when you're talking about Al-Madina's Baya Omar, we said Rosh Hashanah, that the destiny of nations are determined by Rosh Hashanah. And that's where you find by the Rabbeim, whenever there was a Mulchama, there was a war, they always spoke about it. There's this, obviously the story with the Alter Rebbe and the Russo-Franco War, how he stood up, and the story with blowing shofar early. There's the Rebbe Rashab in Teira Shalom, you'll find during the wars that he spoke about the different sarim, the different ministers, so to speak. Every with the Shivim Umbas have Shivim sarim, they have ministers. And of course the Rebbe, Friedrich Rebbe as well, the Rebbe, the same thing. Like for example, by the Yom Kippur Milchama, the Rebbe spoke in the Sichos, the Farbrengens he gave then. So Vov Tishrei, the Rebbe made a siyum in Masechta Chala. But then it was still before the Milchama. But then when the Rebbe spoke out of Sukkah, Gimel Tishrei, and then again and then Shabbos Chalamoid Sukkos, so he used again the expression Niva v'layada maniva on himself. And you know, why did he suddenly make a siyum in Masechta Chala? You know, it's not usually a customary Masechta that the Rebbe would make a siyum, and he says there, at the end of there, it talks about Alexandria in Egypt, and Damascus in Syria, and when you learn in Torah about these things, it gives the kayach to be mamshechir also in the world. So being that we're not on the front lines in Eretz Yisrael, but there are those that are being Meisha Nefesh B'Gashmi's Pasha to defend and protect our brothers and sisters there. So our part is the Mulchamta Shel Torah, to look in the Torah and do what we can on our end, in addition obviously to all the mitzvahs and all the emphasis, especially the ones the Rebbe put on, tefillin, and mezuzah, and tzedakah, and akdus, and chinuch. So in the same context that I've been speaking about in the last few weeks, I'm not here to talk politics, and not here to talk about military strategy. We're talking from the perspective of Torah, so our job is to do as much as possible to be mevareh the inyanim at the root level, and hopefully that will be mamshich down lamata and give kayach and help there. So when the Rebbe spoke, we're not comparing ourselves, but I'm not chazering here my own taters here. So I thought it appropriate to go a little deeper into, I spoke about it last week a bit about Yishmael and some of the Rebbe's answers and the Maimorim that were said by the Rebbe Rashab in Tafrei Samaches and the Friedrich Rebbe in Tafshin Tes and the Rebbe in Tafshin Membeis. So you see, besides the Rebbe talking obviously about Pekuach Nefesh and Shleimus Haaretz, but the Rebbe also speaking about these inyanim in Torah, as I said, Kol Esek B'Torah, when you talk about it in Torah, Torah is the blueprint. So if you can discuss it on the level of a blueprint, you can then bring it down into action. That's how you build a building. That's Istaka Baraisa, Bara Alma, Kayim Alma, that through Torah. So let's talk a bit about that. And as I mentioned last week, this is, even though it's in Chassidus, you know, usually you learn Chassidus, you learn about Eirei and Sof, about Tzimtzum, about Mamal Kalam, Seva Kalam, and all the different sugyas, and we don't really always notice some of the inyanim that are being spoken there that actually were inyanim diyemi, even about what was going on in world events. So it's more beremes, but for example, if any of you want to look look deeper, like the Shari Tshuva, there's a whole maimer there from the Ramitla Rebbe. He talks about Yishmael and Yitzchak, which is going to be the mucker of some of the things I'll say here. But it's a whole lot of Ichus G'dela. As I said, the Torah is never disconnected from the events of the world. So I'm sure they all was a certain birur going on that deeper level. So with that said, this short akdama. So let's talk about that. Something will start. Everything's ashgacha pratis, and again, I don't want to minimize the events going in Eretz Yisrael, Pasha Begashmis, because right now they need our tefillas, and we're dealing with a real enemy, Rotzchim Mamish, even worse than that. So this is not meant to, but I didn't feel giving a share now and start talking about some sugya in Chassidus without addressing the issues was appropriate. So it just goes hand in hand. In a letter from the Frierdiker Rebbe, he writes, I think I mentioned it in Yudalad Ir, Tovshin Ches. So we're talking about during the first Milchama, the Independence War, what's called Milchamas HaShichrur, 1948. So the Frierdiker Rebbe has a whole letter in Igros Kodesh. It's called, it's dated Yudalad Ir, Tovshin Ches, where he speaks about very strong about how we have to participate and do everything possible. Heim begeshem, veheim beruach. And he talks about the ruach, so let's consider this part of the ruach that we're doing. Okay.
Wasn't Zionism in the early days?
Huh?
Wasn't there against Zionism in the early days?
Tavshin Ches? I'm talking about Tavshin Ches. What do you ask?
By that time already was...
That was the war then. You're talking about the letters against Zionism? Is that what you were?
Saying the War of Independence. Like the ultimate Zionist project.
But there's a war of Eden, Koach Nefesh. I mean, it's like saying Eretz Yisrael is the ultimate Zion. Yes, Zion.
Yeah.
Who is Zion? Zion, we say it every day in davening. Nobody ever changed that. You're talking about a political, secular Zionist movement.
Yeah, I'm saying
But us Zion goes back 4,000 years almost. So I'm not sure why is it relevant here? Bottom line is, Eid is in a massive of sakana because he's a Jew. This is not a fight over political parties here. This is a fight of life and death. Okay. And so Hashgacha Pratis, that we're in the weeks this week's in the Parshas that talk mamish about the roots of where all this began. And I'm not talking Beremes even, Beferish mamish. So Parsha Lech Lecha. Parsha Lech Lecha is the Yesod. Avrohom Avinu is the first time he goes to Eretz Yisrael. From Ur Kasdim, he makes his way, beginning of the Parsha, Lech Lecha Ma'atzchem Eladchem Besavicha El Eretz Asher Arecha. At that point, it's still called Eretz Asher. I will show you which land. But it ends up being Eretz Yisrael. And then he starts traveling around Eretz Yisrael. You have Mamish documented that he traveled the places right now where Eretz Yisrael is Begashmis. We're talking now 3,000, Avrohom was born, I think, in the year from creation, 1948, I think, yeah. Something like that, 1956, I don't remember exactly. 48, yeah. 1948, huh?
The war with the four kings happened in 2023.
Okay, there you go. And he's walking through the land, and the Eibishter tells him, this is the land I will give you and your children. Well, this is why we call it the promised land. So right there you have immediately promised to whom? To Avrohom, and then Yitzchak and Yaakov, and then to all Zarachim, their children, which is us. So then it continues. At the end of the chapter, we're going to learn about the birth of Yishmael and the birth of Yitzchak. Or the promise, not yet, the birth of Yitzchak, that will be the next parsha, but the birth, yeah. So you have all if you want, the characters that are really the roots and the ancestors of everything going on in that part of the world. But what I want to touch upon is maybe the most mysterious part, and I don't know if you ever studied it properly with all the Mefarshim and all this, but it's the Bris Bein HaPsarim. So just I'll read a few psukim, and I'll explain it, first the Midrashim, and then Apichsidis. These psukim carry so much, because the Eibishter is really laying out everything that's going to happen in the future. But so we have like this. So that says the Eibishter came, Achad Dvarim Elohei Dvar Hashem al Avrohom b'machzeh, Leimer al Tira Avrohom anechi mogin loch. So Mogen immediately means a shield. Right there, it's a military word. I'll protect you, basically. Schorcha harbe ma'ed. And then Avram, however, asks the Eibishter, Ma titlni v'aneche helech ariru ben Moshe Besi, which, by the way, is like Osarems to Damasek, who Damasek Eliezer. And then Avram says, how will all these promises you're telling me happen if I don't have children? That's what he basically says. So the Eibishter then says, he takes him outside, look up to the heavens, the heaven, so now you have the promise, not just Avram, that I'm telling you, like you see the stars in heaven, so will be your children. Which means both in number, but most importantly, spread all over. And now today we know this promise was fulfilled. Then it was just a haftacha, a promise. So, okay. So then it continues that Hemon b'Havai b'Hashem, Avram believed in Hashem because he needed amunah. You know, you can imagine, Avram didn't even have a child yet. So you need a shtickle amunah to be, someone tells you he's already close to whatever, when the Bris Ben Absarim, 90 years old, maybe already 100 years old. And the Eibishter tells him not only you're going to have a child, you're going to have generations, so you need amunah. Today you don't need amunah. I often talk about this and people are quite amazed because the fact is, here's a promise made almost 4,000 years ago and it was Mekuyim. Everyone sitting in this room, every Eid on earth, is the fulfillment of this haftacha. Okay. Then comes. Huh? No, I'm saying Damol, there was no, you could say, but today, you always need amunah, but today you also have tangible reality. A promise was pale fulfilled. It only helps for those that have shilas. Okay. So then Avram asked the Eibishter, how will I know this? Demonstrate it to me. And this then comes the Bris Ben Absad. The Eibishter tells him to bring an egla misholeshes, and an eiz, and an ayil. I'm going to go to all the details. That was the way you make a bris, bein absadim. You walk through these bein absadim between the two pieces, and that becomes the covenant. But here comes v'yedet ha'ayit al hapagorim. So he talks about vultures, birds of prey they call them. But it says that and vayeshev esem Avram chased them away. What is the emes for that? We'll get back to that. And then it goes like this. This is the main psukim that I want to talk about. Vayi Hashem ishlovei. It's like in very detail was being described the whole scene. The sun sets. The tardema nafla al Avram. And Avram fell into a deep sleep. V'hine ema chashecha gedela nefelas alav. How do we translate? Great dread, frightening darkness and dread fell upon him. And then the Eibishter tells him, Vayim la'Avram yedei teida kiger yeh zarecha. First of all, the word yedei teida double is like he's informing Avram of, the picture of what's going to come. That's what Avram is getting a vision of. He says, there'll be a ger yeh zarecha ba'aretz le'lehem v'ovdim v'eino esem arba me'es shana. And then finally we'll be in Achri Kain. I'm just going around, moving, I'm not going to quote every word here. And then Achri Kain Yetzu b'rechush gadol. V'ata tovel avisecha b'sholem tekova b'sev v'teva. Then he continues on. After this, there's one more pasuk I want to talk about. The next pasuk he says, Vayhi Hashemesh ba. So there again he's talking about the sun setting. V'alota hoya, it was dark. V'hinei Tanud Oshim v'lapid eish asher over bein hagzorim ha'ela. A smoking furnace and a fiery torch passed through these parts. Meaning, and that became, and then he says, B'yei mahu koros HaKadosh Baruch Hu Avram bris leim l'zarecha nesati esa'oretz hazeis minar Mitzrayim ad anar hagodol nahar pros. So there you have it. Then he goes on, K'neini v'knizi v'kadmeni. So first of all, just learning these psukim is itself already kela esig b'teres ha'ela, so to speak. Because we're learning the Torah, this is exactly what the Torah said. And so the Eibishter wanted it, and exactly how he spelled it out. And just this alone is enough arsenal to debate, or not debate, to make the case for Yisrael who it belongs to. But I want to talk about what is this whole emphasis, what's happened, what means he fell asleep at night and then he was afraid, a shudder, or what we call dread or frightening, and then again, this dark furnace. What is all this talking about? Smoking furnace, fiery torch. What does it even mean? Why is Avrohom scared, B'chlal? The Eibush is promising good things. So what's all this pachad here? So the Medrash, obviously, stops on this. I'm saying, what does Rashi say? Does Rashi say anything about this? Yeah. So Rashi does say, what does he say? That this is, that the great frightening darkness is talking about the hardships and the darkness of all the Goliaths that the Eden will go through. Now Rashi is taking this from Medrash. What does the Medrash say in detail? So obviously Mitzrayim is very clearly spelled out, Golos Mitzrayim. That's Beferish, the 400 years. But what are the other things? So the Medrash says, and that's Mokar of Rashi, that the Eibishter showed Avram Avinu all the Goliaths till the end of time. Golos Mitzrayim obviously is Beferish, but there's more Goliaths. There's 4 Goliaths. There's Golos Bavel, there's Golos Yovan, Poros Modai, Yovan, and there's Golos Edom, and many Mefarshim, especially the Mefarshim like the Even Ezra, and those that lived in the Arab Muslim countries, they talk about Golos Shishmol, Barbanel and others. So there's in Daniel also, when you talk about Daniel's vision when he saw that body made out of necheshes and clay and all that, there too the Mefarshim, so to speak, the Ashkenazim Mefarshim touch it on the 4 Goliaths I just mentioned, but the Sfardish Mefarshim touch it also on Golos Ishmael. In Chassidus, when it talks about it, I mentioned last week the Maimer from Tovshin Tes, Tafrei Samaches, and more Maimorim, it talks that the last generations will be, the last Golos will be Golos Edom and Yishmael. The other Goliaths we went through already. Bais Rishon was destroyed by the Bavel. Bais Sheni by Edom, but in between there was Poros, Modai, Yovan, and so on. Okay, so that's when Avram saw these Goliaths, you can imagine it wasn't exactly pleasant, because he saw the tzaras that Eden would suffer. That's the charod. That's what the pasuk is saying. That Tadei Menofla al Avram v'hine eimach hashech g'delin nefelas alav. He saw what we're seeing now. He saw the Holocaust. He saw all the pogroms. He saw all that. I don't know the detail, but he saw enough to frighten him. So while the Eibishter is telling him also the promise that your children will be like the Kechvei Shemayim, and this land will belong to you, he was also showing him what we would have to go through. So as a good father, you could imagine what kind of tzad and what kind of difficulty. And the Medrash goes into detail that every word that I just read, including the words, he says, Tanur, Oshon, Velapid, Eish, those 4 Lashenis are those 4 Goliaths. And as I said, the 4th Goliath, sometimes defined as a 5th Goliath, is Shmuel. Okay, that's the Medrash. And it's not just one Medrash. If you look, for example, the Barbanel, actually in his Sfarim Yeshua, he has a Pirush on Daniel, he has Yeshua's Malki, he has a bunch of Sfarim he talks about. There you see he elaborates, as well as other Mefarshim, on these psukim, and they explain how that laid out. Because remember, they were going through their own tzaras in the time. Barbanel was living in the Sfardish Medinas, and they were dealing with Muslim rule. There were those living in the Christian countries, and everybody was being persecuted, one way or another. Interestingly, the Sfardim, meaning those that lived under the Golos Yishmael, it was always easier than Golos Edom, meaning the Christians. The Christians were always harsher. It changed recently, but that was the way it was over all the datas. Just agav. So what you see here is these psukim are talking about our times as well as the whole history. But at the end of the day, obviously the story is a good story at the end, that Eden will ultimately prevail and Mashiach will come, as the Medrash says and all of them say. I mentioned last week the Rebbe's note to Rabbi Greenglass, and the zeichening to the Maimorim, I'm sorry, the Zohar, Seif Pasha Ve'era, and Zohar Balak, and other Midrashim, Amar Chazal. So there also you see the picture. So if you want to know like the inside story, what's the big picture going on, is that what we're dealing with today is part of a bigger story. I want to make this very important disclaimer. This is not a prediction that on Simchas Torah, Tavshin Pei Daled, there'd be a massacre, Chmona Litzlan, of men, women, and children like there was. It's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the general state of this relative state of affairs in that part of the world. Like, what really does Yishmael want? What do the Bnei Yishmael want? Now, also qualifying Bnei Yishmael doesn't mean they're exactly rooted. Some say that these Palestinians are actually come from a different part of the world, whatever. I'm not getting now into the genealogy, but the point being that area is definitely connected to the Bnei Yishmael. Eden, of course, Bnei Yitzchak and Bnei Avrohom, Yitzchak, Yaakov. And then there's Esav, which comes into the picture in the next parshas. And Esav, we know his grandchild would be Magdiel. End of Parsha Vayishlach, Magdiel zu Remi. Rashi says, Remi is Rome. So basically the Roman, Christian, Western world is coming from Esav. So if you think of history, you'll see that these three forces, Yishmael, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and Esav, really represent the three major religions, what we call today, and the three major empires. And it's not just hinted to. We all know the Medrash, famous Medrash, and Gemara, that by Matan Torah, what does it say? Before the Eibishter came to the Machzina l'Cholum, but it says Beferish that the Eibishter approached two, the Bnei Yishmael and the Bnei Esav. They want the Torah. Why dafka them? Those two. Why not the other nations? So some say he approached also the other nations, but what's Beferish says those two. So many places it says, because those two are the two main umes, and other umes are so-called subcategories. But why those two? Because those are the two are the children of Avram. Yishmael is the son of Avram. Esav is the son of Yitzchak. So who is the Eibishter going to go to? People who had their fathers at least. Well, in the case of Esav, both his father and mother was tzaddikim. In Yishmael's case, his father's Avram. So the Eibishter is presenting them the Torah. Now, of course, they reject it. Why do they reject it? Because they say, they want to see what it says. This says, Le'sirzach, Le'sinaf, Le'signev, different duschayas, what exactly they didn't like, but they couldn't accept it because they couldn't accept these rules. So then the Eibishter went to the Eden and gave them asked them, they said, Nasav and Ishma, that's the story. So the big question is asked, what the Eibishter didn't know, that they're going to say no. Why do you go to them in the first place? And more importantly, and let's say they had said yes, then what happens? What happens with Eden? We just suffered 210 years in a Golas Shen Kameyu, and we had all the promises of Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and let's say those nations say yes, give us the Torah, what would happen to us? What would happen to the... So everybody talks about that. And there's all kinds of beauty. The beauty that I'm going to quote here is from the Tzemach Tzedek, and Eira Torah in Parsha Barachim. And he says, based on a Zohar, he brings different explanations, that the Zohar says, interesting, the Eibishter was preparing them. Yes, he knew they'd say no. But asking them itself was already a birur, because he wanted them to prepare themselves, because one day would be Oz Epech El Am himself a brura. That one day they will accept the Torah, meaning the Shav Mitzvahs Bnei Neach. The Zohar says that. So one way to prepare them is by asking them, okay, you're not ready yet, the day will come. And you could also connect it to a famous Rambam. We all know the Rambam that was cut out by the censors in Perikut Aleph in Hilchos Melachim. What does he say there? After he brings about Yoshka, about Christianity, and then about Islam, he says, no matter what their distortions are, but since everything is Medeas Hashem, we don't know God's mysterious ways. I'm paraphrasing, that both they brought the belief in Mashiach and also in Achdus to all over the world. This is like a pretty radical statement. And I always wondered what the Makar of the Rambam was. It doesn't say anywhere a Makar. Usually the Rambam has a Makar somewhere, a Medrash, a Gemara. I don't know, maybe in the Mafteches and the Rambam they brought some, I'm not sure. But you could say that the Makar of the Rambam is somewhat the Zohar, maybe, according to this beer, because at the end of the day, despite we're not talking about, obviously, if we have Torah, but they took from the pagan world, first the Christians. It was a pagan, Pashta Evdei Aveda Zara, and even though now it's get the Shitruf, whatever you want to call it, but still, they brought the principles of Torah, many of the principles, into Christianity, and brought it to millions, if not billions of people. There are 2.3 billion Christians in the world. And the Muslims is 1.8 billion in the world. So the principles, that's what the Rambam is saying, Yasharas HaDerech. In other words, Eden, obviously, we have our own track going back all the way to Har Sinai. But the Goyish world slowly would be in his barer, it would take time. And when the Rebbe started speaking very aggressively, very strongly in Tov Shem Mem, especially, and on, about the mitzvah of the Rambam, Seif Perek Ches and Hilchos Malachim, that's a mitzvah, not just the Tayyag mitzvahs, but to also lakuf, to inspire, to influence, and not just that, but that was given at Matan Torah. Interesting. He's not just telling them, Shem mitzvah b'nei al pisechel, leisignev, leisitzach, and all the different things. But that was given at Matan Torah, because by Matan Torah, the Eibishter offered the Torah also to them. Meaning Matan Torah is for the whole world. Yes, through Eden, to teach it through Eden, but it's from Matan Torah. So you see, when you look at it all, the story of Bnei Yishmael and Bnei Esav goes through all of history. It starts with in this week's Parsha, but then Matan Torah, a reappearance of Bnei Yishmael and Bnei Esav, and then with the Rambam, and actually, how much time later was Churban Bayis Sheni from Matan Torah? Was around 1,000 years, approximately. Then came Islam in the 6th century, 7th century. And if you think of it in historical terms, you see all the pieces. So it's not a surprise, anyone that learns this in the Psukim, in Ma'or Chazal, especially the way I've just described it, so everyth's set up for major confrontations. So let's talk about that a bit more. So the Arizal says, that by that Mitzrayim is not counted among the Daled Goliaths. Because Mitzrayim...
Don't touch me, man.
We're in the middle of a class.
That's ready to put his hands on me.
We're in the middle of a
Go
class.
back away. Back away. What are you going to do? Hit me? You're like trying. Come on, man. You going to allow that to happen, you guys?
He's a regular. Continue?
Yeah, just started.
Okay. So the Rizal says, because like from the Psukim here, you see Mitzrayim is spelled out. The others are more beremes. Because Mitzrayim is Reish Kol HaGolias, that's what it says in Medrash. Al Shem Shemitzirim L'Yisrael. Kol HaGolias Nekrais Al Shem Mitzrayim. Because Mitzrayim in the language of Chassidus is Keser of Klippa. And the other four, Bavel, Parasamada, Yovan, and then ultimately talked about Eden and Yishmael. Why don't you close the door? Tell him to close the door. Just close the door there if you don't mind. You don't have to leave the door open. Close the door. Okay. Because the others, Keset, and the others either are Chochmah or Bina, there's different ways to explain it. That's on the gay in your name. But let's now talk about, so what do we have here? What's the picture? Why Taka was Avram shown this? Just to show him how bad it's going to be, and then ultimately be the Geula? The answer is no. He was showing Avram, and it was placed in the Torah for us to know this. First of all, to know what's coming. But most importantly, in the language of Arizal, in the language of the Mamorim I quoted from Tavshin Tes, Tafrei Samaches, Tavshin Tes, is that our Inyan is Birur HaUmes. Like I mentioned from the Ram of Shav Mrs. Bnei when you know that the reason we're sent to each Golos. So it's Takim Epnei Chateinu Galinim Artseinu, but there's also an expression that says, the Chazal say, Tzedakah Osar Kodesh Baruch Hu, the Yisrael Shapizra and Lebena Umes. Tzedakah. God did a tzedakah to the Eden that He spread them among the nations. So the question is, what kind of tzedakah is that? It's an Einish. It's a Mepnei Chateinu Galinim Artseinu. So Chassidus explains, It's a tzedakah because now we have the ability to go be mevarer, bein ha'umes, all the nitzutz kedusha that were spread all over the world, mamata lamayla. So basically Hashem is telling Avrohom, tell your children, and it's being put into the Torah, so we learn it every year, lech lecha. Tell your children that in the future they're going to be all over the world. Pizza bein ha'umes. But they're not just to hurt them, but because their job is to be mevarer the umas ha'elam. There'll be times it'll be very difficult because the umas ha'elam will be persecuting them. But even when they're under persecution, that's still their work. So in a way, it was actually an empowering statement. It was like preparing the Eden that you have the keiches, and there's a reason that you're in Golus, and there's a reason, not just as a negative, as a positive. And then when you finish the job of refining each part of the world where you will be, ultimately, echad mechem nitgola the samatya, and all the different lashenis, then you will ultimately achar ken yetze b'rechush gadol, both the rechush gadol from Mitzrayim and the rechush gadol that will come from all these nitzutz kedusha that we elevated in each golus. So it's essentially laying out the future. And if you really look into it, and I did a lot of research on this actually 22 years ago, after 9/11, because then there was a interest by so many people to know what exactly is going on. You know, there was the first time America felt what Israel feels, an attack on their homeland from terrorists. And nobody really understood what do they want. You know, when you attack someone, you usually want something. You want land, you want money, you want resources, you want revenge. What do they want? And I can tell you right now, most Americans have no clue. Their narrative, which is a sheker gamur, is they say the Jews took away their land. They want, so according to basically the real answer is they want, that's the milchama between like Esav and Yaakov. What does Esav want? He wants control. Yishmael wants control. They want to control, they feel that God wants them to control the world, and especially Israel, the Holy Land. So Eretz Yisrael, as we learn later, Zeh Shara Shamayim, it's a bridge between heaven and earth. Yaakov Avinu says, everybody wants that bridge. Everybody wants the portal that connects heaven and earth. The Klippa wants it, and the Kedusha wants it. So the Alter Rebbe brings in Tanya, the Pasuk Lum Ulum Yemotz. There it's about Esav and Yaakov. That is the Nefesh Elikis and Nefesh Habamis in each one of us. A Milchama on the Irktanu Zehaguf. That's in the Elam Cotton. What about an Elam Gadol? It's a Milchama over the world. Who's going to control? The goal is that Kedusha should control. But the goal is not to destroy the negative. The goal is to transform. Like I said, Birer Umes. So this is a Yesod Ikri. That wherever Eden were, the Alter Rebbe talks about it in Torah and Mishpatim. Why when we learn Torah, Shas is Loshen Aramis. Why is it not in Loshen Kodesh? So he says, because part of Birer Umes is Birer HaLashenis. We speak in the language of the time. You know. So when we're speaking now in English or in other languages, it's part of the Birer of the Umes. Now obviously everything al pi halacha. Even Ozil Karta Holach ben Musa, you come to a city, you follow its customs as long as it's al pi halacha. We don't dress necessarily in the garments that Moshe Rabbeinu dressed. We dress in that sneezdik away, al pi halacha, but we do dress in Western clothing. I mean, there's a different discussion, different communities, leishinus, levusham, but point being is that we do engage in the business of this world, and we transform it. That's the whole purpose of why Eden are here. The Ein Neshama comes down lamata. So the point being is that Avrohom was being told, and we're being told, this is the story, my friends. There will be many generations to come, and there are going to be battles fought, and difficult ones. Always know that it's a birur. That was what kept Eden going, even the harshest times. They knew there was some kavon el yena here. As difficult as it was. You know, when the Alter Rebbe chose to the side of Alexander of Russia over France, you think because Alexander was such a tzaddik, he was a Rasha Marush. He was a Tzeder Yehudim, he was an anti-Semite in every possible way. But the Alter Rebbe knew that in some sense, that Golus is easy. It would be easier, Beruchnis for Eden, than the Golus of Napoleon that would promise a lot of physical comforts. So it was always about Birur. That was always the inner story. I'm not going to say every Every man, woman, and child knew it, but the Gdelim definitely knew it. And when you look in the Mefarshim, again, I'm talking a lot, but you look in the Barbanel especially, and others that talk especially Mefarshim and Daniel, they all talk about this. They all talk about how all that's going on in their lives. Barbanel is fascinating, because in his life there was battles going on between the Christians and the Muslims, who's going to control that whole part of the world. Remember, the Christians controlled Europe, and then came what they call the Moors, the Muslims. Once Muhammad came into power, they started conquering, and they conquered part of that world. The Ottoman Empire essentially is rooted in the Middle East. The Christians are rooted in Rome and in Europe. So they fought battles big time. Eden were always the Karbonas, because they both fought the Eden. So we were always stuck somewhere there. But all these things are happening through the generations. So the Eden had a hashkafa, all based on these psukim and based on the Mamor Chazal, that the real story is Birat HaUmis. We're talking about refining the world. So when you really get down to it, I mentioned Esav and Yaakov. That's what many people talk about. But Yishmael and Yitzchak is a similar parsha. When you read the psukim, what was going on with Yishmael and Yitzchak? Esav and Yaakov, we know clearly. It was first of all already in Rivka's pregnancy, Lum Yemotz. And then Yaakov bought the birthright, and then told the brachas. But what was the confrontation between Yishmael and Yitzchak? So you have Ramazim, you have that Yitzchak, that the Sarah saw that he was corrupting him. But what exactly in Hashkafa, what was Yishmael and Yitzchak? So we know, and this is the deeper story, both were children of Avrohom Avinu. That's clear. And so Yishmael as well. Avrohom is Chesed. So it says in Chassidus that Avrohom yotzim memenu Yishmael, Yitzchak yotzim memenu Esav. And it's only Yaakov who is mitoshe shlema, and all the shvatim are all complete and tzaddik. How could from a tzaddik, a neshama d'atzilus, oves heinen markove, how could from Avrohom come out of Yishmael? Per Adam, yod debakel v'yad kol bey, to the point that Sarah says she has to be banished and sent away. So the answer is given because even though Avrohom was obviously a chesed atzilus, but chesed alone, without the measure of gevura and balance, yotzim memenu can be haviyanikas achitzenim. Not chas v'shalom Avrohom himself, but yotzim memenu. It says yotzim memenu came out of him, because chesed without discipline can lead to Yanikas Achitzenim, like the Alter Rebbe brings in Kenteti in Igeres HaKedesh Beis, Chesed Yishmael, Chesed Lumazeh, Chesed without Hagbalas. Like you say, what's wrong with Chesed? It's love. But what does water do to a field if it doesn't have Gevuras Kshamim, if it doesn't have limits? It'll flood the field. You can kill someone with Chesed too. Look at Yishmael's name, Yishmael. That's a very good name, right? The God will listen. Says the Medrash that Yishma is Lashon Osid. Why Yishmael? Because the name of Yishmael is referring to the tefillahs that Eden will say when they'll see B'achris Hayomim, the tzaras that Yishmael will do. So his own name is like so-called Shivri B'tzidei, Minei Be'aba, Lizde Be'narga, that Yishmael's name actually is like Artikun, and all that Yishmael would do. What would he do? So for example, the Muslims, they pray 5 times a day. And some say, I don't know if it's a joke or it's serious, that when Muhammad came to town and he saw the Jews, he walked in the Shul Yom Kippur and he saw 5 tefillahs. And he saw Kedim, he said they keep bowing. So he instituted in Islam that they bow all the time and they have 5 tefillahs. I don't know if it's correct or not correct. But what's going on here? So they do say, it says this in Sfarim, that by Yishmael there's a lot of tefillah because Yishmael. Because after they were sent away from Avram's house, they prayed, and the Malach listened. So there's an inyan of tefillah there. I'm not looking from limud zchus now on the Arabs, Muslims. But al pitera, you have to understand, they are children of Avram. But Yinikas HaChitzenim, as we all know, always begins on a small level, like the Frierdiker Rebbe says. No one gets lost in the woods overnight. You make a little twist, and then who knows what happens. When chesed is not controlled and it's not disciplined, ultimately it can create the worst possible things. What is kanois? Kanois. Someone's a kanoi. What's wrong with kanois? I'm not talking about exceptions, Pinchas, or what Teda says, or the Eberster says. What's wrong with the kanois? The same problem with leisesa v'leisigra. You can say, okay, leisigra, we're not allowed to do less mitzvahs. But what's the problem? Someone wants to add another mitzvah to tayyag mitzvahs. The answer is, dayach masha aslecha tered. Don't become a partner with Hashem. Today you're a partner by adding a mitzvah because you're becoming frumer than God. And tomorrow you're a partner by just subtracting a mitzvah. So too much of something is always not a healthy sign. It says, Yodei bakel v'yad kol bay. What does that mean? It means very aggressive. It means there's no boundaries. Everything is mine. I remember, and I know time is limited, so I'll just say this and then I'll continue next week, hopefully. I remember when 9/11 happened. It's 22 years ago. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. I was walking to my office, which was on top of 770. I come around 9, and I see someone says, something happened in Manhattan. Go up to the roof. So we went up to the rooftop. Yeah, and I see both buildings had already been struck. It was both smoking. They were both standing still. And it was like a shock to see. I have no clue what happened. Someone said a plane went into it. A plane? What are you crazy? You know, who drives a plane into a building? Didn't make sense. So who do I go to? My father. My father always seemed to know things before they happen. So I called him up. He couldn't get through. The cell phones were all overwhelmed because everybody was making phone calls. My father and I get through. My father didn't even know about it. But as soon as I told him, he said to me, "They're Muslims. It's terrorists." I said, "How do you know?" I just told you. He says, "What else?" I mean, he knew. I guess he knew. Then they chased us down from the roof because there was such a panic. No one knew what's happening. Another attack. Whatever. We went down. I remember. So then there was a television on in one of the offices and watching the news. I don't know. Naturally, I gravitated to a chumash, and I went to Yishmael. The first pasuk I saw, Pera Adam, Yodei Bakel, V'yad Kol Bei. And I said, wow, who does such a thing? Only a Pera Adam. You know, it's one thing you're preparing for a war with his cheshbon, his strategy. Just to blow planes, to shoot planes into a building is craziness. Even what we saw on Simchas Torah, October 7th. I mean, the Ritzicha, obviously we were all shocked and horrible. But who does such a thing? Yeah. So you could say, is this a son of Avrohom? So obviously Yishmael was not on that level yet. But the Yinikas HaChatzenim had begun, Yotzim and Yishmael. So when Chesed goes the wrong way, what can happen is, and it's not balanced, there's no discipline, a Pera Adam ends up becoming a terrorist. So they say, not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslim. Where does it come from? It comes from a Chesed without a Gevura. And I'm not trying to, again, be Melamed Zchus, I'm just trying to point out, Apichsidis, that sometimes something could be very passionate. Yishmael was a son of Avrohom. And he learned things from him. I'm sure he learned positive things. And he's also Nimel. Avram Maldim, like we learned in this week's parsha and so on. So, but the root of it starts from there. Now, because of time, I just want to say one, I don't want to end with that line. I want to say, this is not meant just to give us an analysis, it's also meant, what's the tikkun? The tikkun ultimately is that we have to understand what's going on. I have Muslims that I know. There are people writing to me as we speak right now, because I have on YouTube a lot of videos, and people write. There's hate mail, obviously, always, but there are people. I've just saw yesterday, my office gave me a collection of a bunch of people call themselves Muslims, Palestinians. They say, they don't agree with everything I say, but there's a lot of good points. And I'm saying it b'kavanah because I want to educate. I know many people you can't speak to, they're just not shaykh. But there are people that are intelligent enough and not crazy that they could hear. So it's important for us to understand this is also part of a birur. Part of the birur is to fight a war and destroy every enemy. Absolutely. I'm not talking here we're going to sit down and learn chassidus with the terrorists. That's not the goal. You destroy evil. Ba'arta hara mekir b'cha. But at the same time, there are plenty of people in America as well, on campuses and so on, that need Pashto education. That's my real kavanah. But because of time, we'll see this as part one of this, and I'll do part two next week. We should only have Psudas Tevis. Our Asik and Teda of this alone should do the tikkun, and should already have Nasati Shalom Ba'aretz. Le Yarev Le Yashchisu. Mola Aretz Deis Hashem Kamayim Le Yom B'chasim. Okay.